Uh, Thank you, John. It's good to be here. Thank you, PopTech. One of the things that I've feared most going up the chain in my education process is the fear of forgetting. Once you have succeeded, it's very easy to just forget. You tell yourself, I have crossed, that's it. I'm all set. Everybody else who is where they are can fend for themselves. Part of the reason why I'm here at all is that refusal to accept that you can just forget and move on. And so what I want to talk about is this. How would the world be if we all, having succeeded in our endeavors, some of us grew up very poor, and I'll say that in a moment, and we decide that we don't want to accept that reality that we grew up being in, and we go back and we decide to do something about it. It could be gun violence, as you just heard a couple of moments ago. In my case, it's the spectra of poverty. Now, I'll just ask in a moment, how many of you think that poverty is a good thing? Wow. How many of you think that poverty inspires you? I thought so. Because if it didn't, I wouldn't be here. So I take a different view without rejecting poverty as a pathology. Poverty has a way of inspiring people. Growing up in rural Africa, traveling 5 miles to school, 5 miles back. In the midst of war, the war is about to end. It's 1978. And the kid you see in front of you is going to school, walking from the village, on foot, barefoot, no shoes, sometimes with tattered shorts in the back. It's a reality that I lived until I was about grade 5. It's a reality that I see in many African children today. And so the reason why I want and I think that we should constantly go back is precisely the idea that when I come back, coming back from MIT, what they see is what is possible. And that's why I go back. Without poverty, I would just probably not have made it, because I know a lot of friends of mine who grew up very rich and they never made it. Which is not to say it's a bad thing to be rich or to be okay. But it's an experience that I fear that my own children are not going to have because I've worked my socks off. And sometimes when I think about it, being the historian that I am, I ask myself, so what have they lost in not growing up the way I grew up? So that's why I am very interested in going back to establish structures where not only I can be an example to these kids, to tell them, hey, I was where you are, even worse. But this is what is possible. And the question then is, how do you grow up and what are you looking for when you go there? For me, it implies two main things that I'm going to focus on. One is that you go back there with a different eye. The eye of your growing up in this place. I grew up in Zimbabwe, in rural Zimbabwe. I did not go to live in a town until I was in grade 6, which is about 13, age 13. I didn't wear my first shoe as a student in school until I was in grade 6. And so I don't take shoes for granted. It's the source of my humanity. I always want to go back to that moment and say, not what I missed, but what did I learn? So here's what I learned. Here's what we used to do. We used to head cattle out in the valleys. And we used to fish with hooks that we made ourselves. Okay, we stole our mother's crotchets. And we were very interested in the very strong thread that was used there, for which I apologize posthumously. We used to trap birds. Now, no disrespect to bird lovers. For us, it was a hobby, but it was also a way of growing up knowledgeable in the traditions of our forebears. And you won't believe it, but we would make the bird lime ourselves. We would make the bird lime ourselves from a rubber tree, heat the stuff up, and then, chew it. I don't know whether it had medical implications or not, but we would chew this stuff, and then afterward produce a very fine, stretchy stuff, which is more like gum. And then to manipulate its flexibility and yet retain the strength, that when a bird steps on it, we would put some oil in it, a little bit of oil, and then put this stuff up, wind it on a stick, and then put this stuff up in the on top of the tree branches, so that when a bird comes, it settles in, it can't run away, and it would start running, and then catch it. What we were doing there was an experiment. I'm thinking of it as a kind of technological process. My approach to the idea of technology in Africa does not come from very high-handed background. It comes from these basics. Wondering, what exactly were we doing? And if we go back there and begin to ask these serious questions, we realize a whole worldview. We realize a whole vista. We open up new possibilities for critical thought. Something more serious that we used to see our mothers do, they used to make a lot of pots, and it was a space only for women. As I told somebody last night, men were not supposed to be there. It was a strictly gendered space. If a man happened to go around there, it was taboo. The belief or the taboo was that all the pots would crack. It was a space for women. And I began going back, I'm saying to myself, wow, these are some of the spaces, if you are looking at empowerment, which is culturally grounded, you could go to. Meanwhile, the opposite of that is what was happening with spaces like this, where women were not supposed to be there. Both of these processes were conceived of in a kind of reproductive aura. This is before colonialism and through and in spite of colonialism. Sometimes when you talk about Africa, you just think that when Europeans came, they just washed everything away. No, they didn't. These stratagems continued despite the restrictions that were placed. For example, while clay continued to be available, the Europeans settled and established their mines in exactly the places that Africans used to mine their ore. So the only way you could get iron was to go to scrapyards. So there is a degree of adaptability there. And we grew up with such blacksmiths. To the point where today, if you go to places like Swami Magazine in Ghana, you see the very interesting hybrid where academy-trained metal workers and blacksmiths by indigenous tradition fuse these traditions. Second example is Great Zimbabwe, where you had dry bonding, the breaking down of rocks, and their very meticulous bonding into walls that have survived for ages. And one of the things that I wanted to do was to say, what if we imagined the architecture from here and brought folks from around the world to come and study this from here, which is a point that I'm getting to in a moment. The third one is what excites me more so. Growing up, one of the things that we had to do was to till the land and go and plow in the fields. And so many crops. We had millet, we had sorghum, we had rapoko. And this that you see here from pre-colonial times was the industry called beer brewing. It's not a place for men to brew beer in pre-colonial Africa. The people who brewed beer were women. Again, just like the principle of pottery, the beer would get sour if any man showed up. The only place where men would be found was drinking it. And all these traditions of grain preparation and the beer brewing itself were things that we grew up with. Here's what happened under colonialism. European colonizers realized that this is such good stuff. Africans love to drink their beer. There is a way in which we can subsidize our colonial project by banning beer brewing, making it illicit, and then monopolizing it in municipalities and government breweries, with the result that beer or wine that had been brewed from the marula fruit and from sorghum, where somehow something happened, and the result is that drink you see on the left, and amarula, which some of you know. The reason why I ask about this is precisely because I am going back now to Africa with a very, very different eye. I want to look at these things. Where were they going? What's their state? What can we see in the world out there traveling and bring back? Somebody was talking about open source just a couple of minutes ago. It's exactly what I'm looking for. The idea that you can build a place and assemble a coalition of scholars, of doers, of makers, thinkers, to come to a space and share in a new mode of knowledge production in rural Africa that builds on what people already know. Part of the reason why development fails is the assumption that the poor are only poor. That's all they know. That's their state. We love the numbers. I love them too. But let's not get carried away by the psychosis of numbers. Let's think much more in terms of what do people already know? What can we build upon that, with that, and through them? And so that's why I'm building this center at Makuleke. It was interrupted by the tenure process. I needed to get tenure, which I have now. And yeah, and so I am at a stage now where I am now going back and actually fundraising for the project. 2 of the projects already have funding, but the idea is to train undergraduate students and graduate students in field-based collaborations with ordinary folks, and to bring policymakers and people of goodwill who are smart to come down there. It's just off Kruger National Park. This is a community that owns part of Northern Kruger National Park. and build something together and imagine a new future. Thank you.